Composting is a fantastic way to recycle nutrients back into the garden, back into the soil, and make the soil healthier in the process. It also keeps a bunch of unnecessary waste from accumulating in landfills, which is by and large a very good thing. So overall, composting can be a great asset to gardening, right? But how do we actually go about this process of composting our food and garden wastes and making them into a usable product? So we covered the why. Next, what gets composted? We have all these different organic wastes, whether it be kitchen scraps, produce discard, grass clippings, mulch, or like wood chips, branches, coffee grounds, tree leaves during the fall. And that is not an exhaustive list, right? There are so many different organic sources that we can use, but the twist is that these different types of organic materials contain different ratios of carbon to nitrogen. And so this carbon to nitrogen ratio is really important, right? Carbon and nitrogen are two elements on the periodic table. Carbon is biologically central to all organic matter, right? And nitrogen is important for all these different living organisms because it is important in protein synthesis, right? It is part of proteins. But having a good ratio that's around 30 parts carbon to 30 parts nitrogen is important, because we don't want to have too much nitrogen in the compost, because this creates a situation where the compost can become smelly, right? It can produce all this ammonia, or it can also, if it gets wet, because the nitrogen is soluble in water, and that can leach off and cause either water contamination or ecological imbalances in streams, rivers, and all those other water bodies, right? So we don't want to have too much nitrogen. Also, even the compost can be termed as too hot, right? Whereas if you mulch high nitrogen compost around plants, it can burn them, right? It can actually injure them, potentially even kill them. So we don't want to have too much materials that contain high amounts of nitrogen. But we also don't want to have too much carbon, because if we have too much carbon, right, the decomposition is not going to happen very effectively, and it's going to be slowed down a lot, and it's going to be harder to get that compost pile up to temperature, right? So we want to have that balance of carbon and nitrogen. Like I said, that 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, right? So coffee grounds, food scraps, grass clippings, those are all green materials, right? So when I say green, that means high nitrogen. Wood chips, branches, autumn leaves, those are going to be high carbon sources, right? So for example, take the wood chips, for example, those have 600 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So they have a lot of carbon. Whereas on the other side of the scale, if we take fresh grass clippings, those are going to be in the realm between 12 to 25 to 1. So those are going to be a green material, very high nitrogen. But I don't want to go too much into the math in this video. I don't want it to be too overwhelming, because it can be really easy to start overthinking this whole process. And so basically all we really have to do, if we take a compost pile, or if we're creating a compost pile, we take 1 bucket, like 5-gallon bucket full of green food scraps, and then we'll pile 2 or 3 buckets of brown material right on top of that, right? Maybe it's wood chips, hay, dry leaves, or a combination thereof. And as long as we keep that pile covered and it doesn't smell overly sweet, which could be an indication potentially of too much carbon, and it doesn't smell like ammonia, which could be an indication of too much nitrogen, then we're in a pretty good spot. And of course, if we're monitoring that temperature too, to make sure that temperature is within range, right? If it's too cool, that could be an indication of too much carbon. And if it's too hot, that could be an indication of too much nitrogen, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be super complicated. Now we have compost methods, and we have 2 main types of composting, right? So we have thermophilic composting and mesophilic composting, right? And in thermophilic composting, so we have that root word therm, right? Like thermometer, temperature, that is the hot composting method. Basically, that translates to temperature or heat loving composting. We're aiming for a temperature range between 131 and 165 generally. This is going to enable the compost pile to heat up and kill off the pathogens so that that compost can be broken down and it can be safe for application. And then we have the mesophilic composting, right, which is not temperature sensitive, but that can be a little bit more complicated because it can take a longer time for that material to break down, decompose, and to be safe in terms of pathogens. So the thermophilic composting is usually safer and it takes a shorter amount of time than the mesophilic composting. Now we have different methods of getting compost, right? We have, of course, the worm composting or vermicomposting. Now that's actually kind of more like a mesophilic composting in a way, right? Because we're not, if it gets too hot, we end up killing the worms, and that's not really a good thing. We also have the Hermetia or Hermetia composting, using the black soldier fly in a similar way in how we do worm composting. That's also kind of a mesophilic technique. And then we also have the windrows, right, or the backyard compost pile. It's basically the same concept. And this can either be a mesophilic or probably more ideally a thermophilic composting method, right, where we do want to get that compost up to temperature. We also have the in-vessel composting. So this may be some type of a compost turner or some type of automated machine, whatever the case may be. And so the interesting thing about this is that it's a super closed off environment. So in some cases it can be really easy for temperatures to get super high. And then before I go any further, it's also important to be knowledgeable of any pertinent regulations. So whether if that has to do with where you live, you know, any regulations surrounding that, whether it be HOA or whatever, but also if you are functioning as a business and you are producing your own compost, there are different regulatory standards that need to be met with that, and especially if you're certified organic or something like that, you'll have to be cognizant of some of these different NOP regulations, also the Food Safety Modernization Act, right? And so it's always good to make sure that we are abiding by any pertinent regulations as is applicable, right? And I don't want anyone to get busted. So we kind of talked about the carbon to nitrogen ratio. It is expressed usually as a C to N ratio. And then we also have water and oxygen, right, which are two very important aspects as well. All life needs water, and so the microbes in the compost that are busy breaking down those food scraps and organic materials need water in order to live and carry out their biological functions, right? So the water is important, and especially if the compost is getting too hot, this can be a way that we can cool it down. And conversely, if the compost is too cold, we can also check the moisture and it might be too low or it might be too high. But usually what we go for with the water is we want to make sure that we have between a 40 to 60% moisture reading in the compost pile, and usually this is going to be for like a windrow or backyard pile. Some of the other composting methods may actually do better with a different moisture ratio. Vermicomposting, for example, you know, the moisture might need to be higher. And then of course we have the oxygen, right? So the oxygen is super important, right? Because these microbes need to be able to respire, right? So they're taking in oxygen so they can have the energy to function in breaking down this organic waste. Without oxygen, we get fermentation, right? And that's, in this context for making compost, that's really not what we want. So we want to make sure that we have enough oxygen supply getting into the pile. And so usually this can be accomplished pretty well by turning the pile, aerating the pile, right? Every so often, and also making sure that we don't have too much moisture in the pile, because if we go above 60% or so, that can actually create anaerobic or anoxic conditions, which would actually encourage fermentation. And that's a totally different set of bacteria and microbes, ones that we're not really trying to go for in terms of aerobic compost. Right, and if there's not enough oxygen, and if it's too wet, or the material is too compacted, you'll be able to tell, right? It's going to smell really bad. And if it does start to smell like that, you can usually reinvigorate it by just turning the pile, and aerating it. And then over the next few days or so, that should continue to balance back out. And then we also want to talk about helpful tools that can really come in handy, right? I talked about measuring the moisture and measuring the temperature. So it's a good idea to make sure that we have a good compost grade thermometer to be able to accurately measure the compost, right? And so we want to make sure that we get a properly sized thermometer, one that's going to reach deep down into the pile, because some of these compost thermometers come in different lengths. So we just want to make sure that we are choosing an appropriate length for the appropriate, scope and size of our pile. Also, same thing with the moisture meter, that they come in different sizes as well. And so these moisture meters can be really helpful for determining the moisture. Usually it's on a scale of 1 to 10, but that can translate from 0 to 100%. Also, a pitchfork or a shovel, but especially a pitchfork in the beginning, can be really helpful to help turn the pile by hand, right? Especially if we're talking about like a small backyard pile, this can be really helpful. A shovel is better for like closer to finished compost. If you have a larger composting area, and you happen to have a bucket hooked up to a tractor that you also happen to have, then by all means, that's another great option. And then additionally, a tarp can be really helpful. It can help keep some of the heat in if it gets colder. So these compost piles can really start to heat up. And then it also can help to wick off some of that excess water, like coming in from the rain. So it can be used to help to control moisture, help to hold moisture in, but also help to keep excess moisture out. And I've also found that using a tarp on a compost pile provides an excellent habitat for some of our smaller snakes, right? Like the red-bellied snake and the ringneck snake. And I've done videos on both of those, and they're super beneficial snakes, really good snakes to have around. What types of materials do we want to avoid? Obviously, metals, plastics, glass. We want to make sure that we're doing a good job of sorting those types of materials out of the system. Glass can be dangerous. Plastic can be dangerous in other ways, with creating microplastics and nanoplastics. And while we're on the topic of plastics, which unfortunately is a huge aspect when it comes to materials that we want to avoid, dryer lint, right? We want to make sure that we're not putting that in there, because commonly a lot of us may wear polyester-based clothing at times, or nylon, or some of these other synthetic fibers, even for certain articles of clothing that we might not think about, right? Like socks are a big one. In order to have them make a good fit around the ankle and to be stretchy, right, they usually contain a lot of those different synthetic fibers in order to be like comfortable or whatever, right? So dryer lint can be a really easy source of microplastics and nanoplastics, and it's just really not something that we want to use. And also, especially when it comes to produce, right? Sometimes, especially produce that might come from a market or a grocery store, can contain rubber bands or produce stickers. These are synthetic materials that do not break down in compost, and we don't really want them to break down in compost either. Again, we have those petroleum-based products and the microplastics and nanoplastics and those types of concerns. I know for me personally, the produce stickers are just really annoying, because sometimes I just, I don't see them on a fruit or something, and they end up in the compost, and then I apply this compost to the garden and I see all these little produce stickers, and then I have to go through and pick them out. So it's just really a good thing to be as responsible as you can be, and make sure to not be adding those materials into the compost. And especially sometimes the temperatures in the piles can get pretty hot, and they can actually begin to kind of like melt some of the stickers a little bit, and then it can make it more challenging to like pull them off the produce skins or whatever if you find them in the compost pile. So it's just kind of a mess. So it's just kind of a little pet peeve of mine at this point, is I just make sure I get all the stickers off. And while we're still on the topic of plastics, unfortunately, I have to bring in the paper and cardboard products, because when we talk about paper, like advertisements or certain types of cardboard can be shiny or glossy, and this can be done to prevent weather from damaging the boxes, or oil and grease from leaching into the cardboard, for like in a pizza box. But unfortunately, a lot of these chemicals that are applied to these cardboards and plastics, or cardboards and papers, to make them shiny or glossy or, water or oil resistant, right? They can be microplastics, they can be PFAS, they can just be some serious endocrine disruptors. So again, any type of paper or cardboard that is shiny or glossy, or anything like pizza boxes, fast food wrappers, those types of things, you just don't want to be using those at all. And also even any recycled papers or recycled cardboard, because commonly what can happen is all these, paper products or cardboard products that are being recycled, some of these can be the shiny and glossy ones too, and they just all get ground back up and formed into these new paper or cardboard products. And so those can also contain the microplastics, nanoplastics, PFAS, all those things. So anything that's made from like recycled paper or cardboard is not something that I use. And then additionally, any brightly colored inks that are on boxes or papers may also contain other problematic chemicals, even in some cases potentially heavy metals. And then also any tape or glues that were used to glue flaps together on cardboard, I always make sure I remove those. So in general, I use very little cardboard, and if I do use it, I make sure it's just as plain as possible and as pure as possible, which is really hard to guarantee. And also I find that adding cardboard in general tends to make the temperatures tank for some reason. So I usually just don't use all that much cardboard at all, but even just like cardboard or paper in general, I don't really add too much of it. I also want to add that generally any materials that are advertised as being compostable are usually really not, right? Especially when we're talking about the plastic cups or the paper cups with the wax coatings, or some of the compostable straws or utensils. Generally, if a company feels that it needs to convince you that something is compostable, it's probably not your best option. If it doesn't look compostable, it's probably not. Some of these biodegradable plastics or compostable plastics actually contain synthetic binders, or they can just get messy in the decompositional process before they break down completely. And depending on the type of composting you do, might not be enough time for some of these different products to break down more completely, not to mention, of course, with some of the potential residues that they may leave behind. So while I am optimistic about the biodegradable plastics and things maybe someday becoming effective and functional, as I see it, we don't seem to be there yet. And definitely don't get duped into getting a bunch of compostable products that might not actually be. Not to mention, a lot of these compostable products are coming from conventionally grown plants that have had a pretty huge environmental impact, negative environmental impact on the land on which they've been grown. So that's all kind of stuff to keep in mind. So definitely at this point, I'm not a huge fan of the compostable products. I just really try to keep my compost additives to be as natural as possible, right? Really I try to have it reflect like an optimal diet of being, more natural, more organic, local, as much as possible. And then also we want to make sure that we're not adding materials that have been sprayed with different types of pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, whatever the case may be. Especially some of these neonicotinoids can be systemic, and they can hang around for multiple years. And neonicotinoids are insecticides, and they can find their way into compost. They can be applied to a field then in the form of compost and be taken up by plants and have deleterious effects to various types of insects. Same thing with some antibiotics or other types of medications that may be given to certain farm animals, like horses or whatever, can find their way into the compost, especially if we're adding manure from certain animals that might not be coming from a very great quality source. Also, any treated wood or painted wood, like pressure treated wood or any wood that has paint on it, we want to make sure that we're not adding that in, or any wood that has glues on it or anything like that. Especially like if you're using wood chips or sawdust. You want to make sure that you're sourcing that as responsibly as possible and that you're knowledgeable about where that's coming from. So that's really the basics of composting. In general, it's a really beneficial thing to be able to repurpose or recycle a lot of this what would otherwise be food waste, and cycling that back into the natural system. So thank you so much for checking out this video on composting. I tried to really kind of boil it down and just go over the basics, but as you can tell, there can be quite an art and quite a science to it, and the details are there that can be gone into. But it's also very easy to get caught up into it and get overwhelmed or confused, so I really tried to keep it as basic as I could in this video. And maybe in future videos I will continue to expand on this concept and go into different areas. I have some pretty cool ideas lined up for the future in terms of composting and as it relates to gardening. So definitely stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thank you so much for checking out this video, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.